I'll speak about Georgian literature, and because it's what's important. We are now saying that Georgia is striving towards European integration, and we understand ourselves as a European nation. In which sense? Some kind of milestones of European culture is very dear to Georgians. It's not only it started like 25 years ago or something, but it's deeply entrenched in Georgian culture, and with this culture is the spiritual culture. This what is in the depth of it is visible in literature, and we can already from early Middle Ages see how Georgians perceive themselves, because this is recorded in literature, in the literary sources. Because Georgia, as you know, became a Christian kingdom in 4th century, when Saint Nino of Cappadocia came to Georgia and preached Christianity, and she managed to how to say, convert or persuade king and the queen that Christianity is true religion, and then from up to down, this royal house Christianized the entire country. Of course, not without violence, because you see that king and Saint Nino were quarreling. The king wanted to send army and subdue by force of army the Georgian mountains especially, and Nino is saying that you don't understand what Christianity is. It's not about sword, it's about words and grace. But the king still didn't listen to her, and a bit used his sword. A bit. What does that mean, a bit? Nobody knows. Maybe 1,000 people or 100 people killed, I don't know. But anyhow, this country was Christianized, and Christianization led to the necessity of Georgian alphabet and script to be developed, because in Eastern countries, when Christianity was preached, it was preached in the native tongue and preached in the religious culture, the liturgies, the prayer culture. Did not have any holy language like in the West, Latin, but it was translated everything in vernacular languages like Armenian, Georgian, Syrian, Coptic. So in Georgian also, since it was to be translated in vernacular language, so Georgian script appears there in 4th century, late 4th century already. We have most ancient samples from 5th century Georgian mosaics in Palestine, in Jerusalem. Also in Georgia we have 5th century inscriptions in Bolnisi. You may have seen it, I don't know if you have been to excursions in Bolnisi. So then Georgians started to translate. Of course, first of all, gospel texts, like 4 Gospels. Apocalypse was not translated until 9th century, the Revelation of John, because Apocalypse, Revelation of John, was not used in liturgical cycle. It's very difficult symbolic text, and that's why you don't use it in religious practice of church services. That's why it was only later in 9th century it was translated, but all the other things were translated, like of Byzantine literature, like hagiography, homiletics. Homiletics means the preaching culture, when you read sermons. This literature, monastic literature, ascetical literature, what does it mean? In Georgian, from 6th century onwards, a very developed culture of monasticism started to spread. From Syria, very austere monks came to Georgia in 6th century by invitation of Georgian church, that they may fight Zoroastrians, because Georgia is sandwiched between 2 empires, the Persian Empire and the Byzantine Empire. And Persians tried to spread Zoroastrianism in Georgia in order to have political dominion here. And then Georgian church asked very strong, austere monks from Syria who came to Georgia and established like network of 13 monasteries here. And some of them are still functioning. Some of the young women, for instance, you can go through there. There is a living culture of this monastic tradition. And monasteries became houses of literature, houses of translation. All genres of Byzantine literature was translated in Georgian. And not only in Georgia, this monastery spreads throughout the world. In Palestine only, there were 29 Georgian monasteries. They were in Asia Minor, in Cyprus even, in Bulgaria. So this was the centers from which Georgians somehow fed themselves by everything progressive what was happening in the world. Now, from the early Middle Ages, Georgians started to understand themselves as a Christian nation. For instance, in the 7th century, Abba of there was a in 8th century, when Georgia was already occupied by Caliphate, Arabs, Arabic Caliphate, the Arab boy, 17 years old Arab boy, came to Tbilisi and studied Christianity, and he adopted Christian faith. And for this, he was, by Sharia laws, killed here in Georgia, in Tbilisi. Abba of Tiflis, his name is Saint Abba. And in Saint Abba's life, it's written, this hagiographer writes, we are situated on the edge of the world. What does it mean? Of course, behind Georgia there are other countries, but they're not Christian countries. So this writer perceives them himself as kind of part of big Christian oikumene, world Christian oikumene, and on the edge of this oikumene. So he said that not only Constantinople, not only Byzantines have this holy faith of Christianity, but also we, those who live in this remote place, is on the edge of the world. So the Georgians perceive themselves as Christian world, kind of Christian nation on the edge of the illuminated or enlightened world. Also, our king Vakhtang Gorgasali, who founded Tbilisi actually, when he was dying, he wrote this kind of testament to Georgians: love Greeks. He himself, what does it mean Greeks? Greek means Byzantines. Yes, he meant in this is Greek culture, which is a Christian culture for medieval Georgians. So Vakhtang Gorgasali said, love Greeks. Himself, he was of Persian origin. Vakhtang Gorgasali, his name is Vakhtang, is Varan Khosratang, it's kind of very Zoroastrian name, but he was Christian, of course, he's a saintly Christian king, but his name was Persian, his origin was Persian. Varan Khosratang means that this Varan or Varatrangha was Zoroastrian god of victory, and so his name comes from there. But he said, yes, by blood I'm Persian, but by my culture and by my by my commitment, I'm a Christian, and so that's why I love more Greeks than Persians. That's why when he was dying, why? Because he was wounded in a war against Persians. Persians asked him, let's go against Byzantium together, as we were doing it before. And he said, no, before we go against Byzantines, against Roman Empire, because they didn't call it Byzantine, it was Chromni or Roman Empire. You have to fight against me, because they are my co-religionists. So I put religious affiliation higher than my blood affiliation with you. So this is what is written by hagiographer. We don't know actually what he was saying, but that's how it was perceived. So Georgians perceive that, yes, we are part of this greater world. And you see this, that even more than Byzantines, for instance, Georgians try to have better connections with the Western Europeans, even in the Middle Ages, than Byzantines, because there was always great animosity between the West and Byzantium. But Georgia was not part of this animosity. Georgians perceived, oh, they are Christians, these are also Christians, why should we quarrel with the West? Even after the schism, in 1051, when there was a schism, when Roman Pope, through Cardinal Humboldt and Byzantine and Constantinopolitan Patriarch Michaelis Keluralius, they cursed each other, and so there was first church split between West and the East. Even after this, Georgian monk in Mount Athos, George of Mount Atonai, George of Mount Athos, is summoned by Byzantine emperor, and he was considered as a big theologian and great theologian, and Byzantine emperor, sometime in 1067 probably, asks him, what's the difference between Latins and us, Byzantines? And George is saying, there is not much difference. Difference only is in rites, but essentially the same faith. So you have this kind of unleavened bread, Latins say, we have leavened bread, but this is all symbols, and this leavened bread is symbol of against some heresies which spread in Byzantium. That's why Byzantines needed this leavened bread. Latins did not have these heresies. That's why they don't need this leavened, yes, yeasted bread, yes, in the liturgies. So these are just the rites, but essentially the same faith. And he even said that Latins were more upright in holding the faith. That's why, because in Byzantium many heresies spread, and Georgians and Latins are less heretical than even Byzantines. He was saying this. But he was kind of reconciliatory policy between Latins and Greeks, East and West. The Georgians did not have this animosity against the West. That's why they financed, even in Mount Athos, Benedictine monastery in the 11th century. The Benedictine monks came to Mount Athos from Amalfi, and they were kind of not met with much friendliness by Greeks, but Georgians gave them money to establish their monastic house next to Georgian monastery in Mount Athos. So, also Georgians were translating Oriental literature. We have this, Europe means eyes wide open, yes? Europe, etymological, Europe means eyes wide open. So Georgians also were European in this way, they had eyes wide open. Unlike Byzantines, who consider themselves as #1 civilization, Constantinople is the city of God, and we don't have to learn from anybody else because we are #1. Let others learn from us. Georgians were not so. They were taking from Greek, they were reading ancient literature from the Orient, translating from there. For instance, in 9th century, Georgians translated the Christianized version of Buddha from Persian. And in 11th century, this work was translated by Georgian monk into Greek. And from Greek, it spread into Latin. And now in Catholic church calendars, in Orthodox church calendars, you have this Buddha, Christianized version of Buddha, Yodasaf, as a Christian saint. So Buddha somehow crept into Christian church calendars through Georgian translation. So this shows that Georgians were very much open to all type of cultural influences. And that's why it somehow made Georgian culture very vivid and vibrant and very creative. Especially when from 11th century onwards, when Georgians started to translate also philosophical literature from Greek, not only theological, not only Christian literature, but also they started to translate Aristotle's categories, Aristotle's logic. They started to translate some Neoplatonic authors, Plato's writings, and especially it was important with such figures as Ioanne Petrizi, who in 12th century translated a very important Greek Neoplatonic philosopher, one of the last representatives of Neoplatonic Academy, Proclus Diadochus, Proclus, the successor of Plato. And Petrizi, why is Petrizi important? Because nobody could do in Byzantium what Petrizi has done in Georgia. Why? Because in Byzantium there was a very strong imperial censorship upon all the creative thoughts and philosophical kind of musings, because they considered philosophy is dangerous and it can lead to heresies. And at that time when state and church are together, the heresy is very dangerous for stability of the country. That's why it was very harsh and a very strict censorship. But Petrizi in Georgia had enjoyed much freedom under King David, probably King David the Builder, so he could do whatever. And what was clandestine and hidden in Byzantium, he revealed here and wrote very important writing where he commented Proclus, but at the same time presented Christianity, biblical truths, and philosophical truths of Greek philosophers, especially Plato and Neoplatonists, as one body of truth. He said that if you want to read Bible correctly, you have to read Bible with philosophical eyes. You have to put in the biblical symbols metaphysical significance and meanings. And he puts in Bible metaphysical meanings. He fills Bible with metaphysics. And on the other hand, he somehow enriches, as he understands, metaphysical culture of Greeks by certain kind of influences which is only found in Gospel. So he creates kind of eclectic vision of the world, where there is one universal gnosis of all mankind, and in this gnosis, different nations participate, people of different religions even participate, because in us there is certain hermeneutical principle. He calls it innate Hermes. And this innate Hermes does not depend on your country, on your religion, or on your race. It is a kind of universal hermeneutical principle in each of us, and through this we can understand each other, people of different nations. So it's very broad and wide picture. In 12th century, nobody in Byzantium would have written like this. Of course, he was educated in Constantinople, and he fled from Constantinople to Georgia later. In 13th century, maybe you have heard about it, and this development of this type of culture, we have the great poet Shota Rustaveli, who wrote this famous poem, Night in Tiger's Skin. So Night in Tiger's Skin, that's an epic poem. It's a heroic story about how these three heroes rescue a queen from hands of evil people, and so it ends. It's a happy end of marriage of these good people. Whatever. So three heroes rescue a princess. It's a plot is not very important, but important is the ideas expressed in this great epic poem. These ideas are taken from many different cultures. Rustaveli is writing this poem somewhere in a library where he has books from Christian tradition, he has books of Christian theologians, he has biblical writings, he knows them very well. He knows Plato's philosophy, he quotes Plato a few times. He knows Dionysius the Areopagite, Christian Platonist, who introduced the Platonic ideas of eros, of love, into Christian mysticism. And on the other hand, even broader than Patrizzi, Rustaveli knows also Eastern wisdom. He knows Persian wisdom, he knows probably Chinese wisdom, because he quotes some Chinese expression, whoever does not look for a friend is enemy of himself. It's written in China, he says. So he could learn something from Chinese wisdom as well. And he knows Sufi mysticism very well, and he introduces the Sufi images of like ruby, which loses its color, its red color on a sun's rays, because it gets sunny and yellow by sun's rays. It's a very Sufi image as a divinization of human soul, which is following God's commandments, this kind of ideas. So it's a very eclectic. And he introduced this thing in Georgian mental culture. And still, Rustaveli's poem became a part of Georgian identity. If you stop at a taxi now, and any taxi, and you ask a taxi driver, any taxi driver, to quote some stanza from Rustaveli, at least one stanza he will know. And it's kind of ubiquitous. Everybody in Georgia should know something of Rustaveli. Rustaveli created this broad vision of Georgians about the world. So world is, everybody should be respected as a person, notwithstanding one's religion or one's, I don't know, color of skin or whatever. So from the Middle Ages, from the 13th century, you have this very broad understanding of reality, which is quite Renaissance type. This happened in Italy only like 2 centuries later with Quattrocento. But you have these Quattrocento tendencies, very strong ones in Georgia. Shava Nutsubidze, a famous scholar in 20th century, he even created a theory of a Georgian Renaissance. And so and with Patrizzi, with Rustaveli, and of course it was not Renaissance in Italian way, in the sense that Italian Renaissance changed and shaped the future of Europe. Georgian Renaissance was very local, and it was somehow nipped by invasion of Mongols in 13th century. So it was kind of stopped by Mongolian invasion, so it didn't have a later development in world culture. Only you can see as a fact that what was happening in Italy was already happening in Georgia. You read Rustaveli, and it's like, it's very much in spirit similar to Pico della Mirandola. So it's the same broad vision of the world. So I spoke about this tragedy of 13th century when Mongols invaded Georgia, and after that, the Georgian culture is more like not towards, how to say, creative development, but towards self-preservation. Georgians are already struggling for preserving their Christian identity. You have many saints, of course, who died in the wars and who held fast with their faith, and that's why we were killed by especially Muslims, powerful invaders. But to say that before 18th century Georgian literature was developing, I wouldn't say very much. There was some kind of development, mostly it was Persian influences and imitation of Persian poets, but not very much of some kind of blowing up some kind of development of the culture, like it happened in 12th and 13th century. And so, but from 18th century, you already have new European currents in Georgian literature. We have a very famous poet, David Guramishvili, who was kept in a prison in Prussia, in Germany. And when he returned from there, he couldn't return to Georgia, but he returned to Ukraine. And in Ukraine, he was given a kind of a feudal estate, because he was a nobleman. And he started to write poetry there, and he wrote a beautiful book called Davitiani. His name was David, and Davitiani is the poetry of David. So you can translate it like this, Davitiani, but he has allusion also to Davidni, it means Psalms of David. So his poetry is religious poetry, and he imitates David, but also it's not David himself, but he's a little David, like imitating big biblical David. So it's a Davidian and play of words. In Georgian, the psalm is Davidni, and this is Davidian, so it's almost the same. But what is interesting in his religious poetry? It's very Protestant type Christianity what he's reading this poetry. I mean, he's not Protestant, he remains Orthodox, traditional as if, but his way of dealing with human relationship with God is very much like Lutheran, I think, because in from Luther it comes that you don't have to rely on hierarchies while addressing yourself to God. Because you can immediately address God through your conscience. And Gigineishvili has a similar attitude. His space, his heaven, is not anymore inhabited by hierarchy of saints. His heaven is kind of clear from saints, and even you immediately are addressing to God. And sometimes it's difficult to divide between his address to his own conscience and to God, because it's almost the same. You're speaking to your conscience, or you're speaking to the word of God. So it's very much novel type of religiosity, which probably he got when he was in exile in Germany. And so I had this lecture on Gigineishvili here at this Caucasian house, because Caucasian house makes this kind of lecture events, and this was last year. I read my presentation about Gigineishvili poetry, and I went in depth in his poetry and showed him by examples how much non-traditional he is in his dealing with religion. And his religion is also very much, democratic. Because if you read medieval Georgian hymns, they are very difficult and very arcane. You must be very much developed into this kind of metaphoric language. But Gigineishvili's religious hymns are very simple and democratic. He wants everybody to be invited in this kind of hymnology. So after Gigineishvili, we have great connections with European cultures through Russia. Of course, from the end of 18th century, Georgian kings search for some kind of more intensive connection with Russia in order to protect themselves from Persian invaders. And in 1783, Georgians, King Iraklis II, penultimate Georgian king Iraklis II, and Russian Emperor Paul II, they had this agreement, a treatise of Georgievsk, according to which Georgians said that we are not free anymore in our foreign policy, but you don't interfere into our internal affairs. So Georgian kingdom is still a kingdom, but okay, when we will do something, foreign, when we have some foreign decision about foreign policy, we shall ask the Russian emperor then. And we are obliged to help Russian emperor in Russian Empire's wars, and Russian emperor is obliged to help Georgian king in Georgians' plights against Persians. Of course, Russians didn't help, and in 95, King Irakli had to face Persian Shah, Aga Muhammad, so alone. And that's why his army, which was only 5,000 of men, they fought valiantly, but were defeated by overwhelming Persian powers. And Tbilisi was massacred at the time. And 2 years later, the same Aga Muhammad Khan wanted to invite Tbilisi anew, but fortunately for Tbilisians, he was killed by his own servants. So, but this showed that Georgia's position was very volatile already. And our last king thought that maybe, I see that it's already impossible for Georgia to withstand Persian invasion alone, and Russians will not help us unless they turn Georgia into their province. So it was already kind of doomed situation. And he was thinking in these terms that if Georgia becomes part of Persia, now we shall lose our Christianity, and Christianity is the identity of Georgians. With Russians, of course, we lose our political independence is a tragedy, but since Russians are Christians, we shall retain our Christian identity. So that was his decision, and he even wrote to Paul II his letter that by saying that take Georgia as a Russian province after my death. And this letter survived. So you cannot tell really that Russians, I mean, with 100% the Russians annexed Georgia. It was, yes, annexation in the sense that they were not fulfilling this Treaty of Georgievsk. They led Georgia to this situation by this, because Georgiev's treaties made Georgia very hostile to Persia. They were punishing us, and Russia was not helping us. So Georgia was led to this very difficult situation in order to make this step. And not everybody, and many Georgian noblemen were not agreeing with king in this. But still, Georgia, you can't say that it was 100% annexation, because Georgian king really wrote this letter to Russian emperor. And from 18th century, Georgia became part of Russian Empire. But this was not only bad, this was also good in the sense that Georgians could already drink, so to say, metaphorically, from European culture through Russian. And this was very productive for Georgian culture. In 18th century, we have great intellectual Solomon Dodashvili, who read Immanuel Kant, and he knew Kant so well that he wrote a textbook about Kant's logic. And this textbook was the first textbook on Kant's logic, so successful that it was used throughout Russian Empire in all Russian universities. So this Enlightenment ideas, because Immanuel Kant wrote this, what is enlightenment? Yes, this enlightenment idea through Dodashvili came to Georgia. Dodashvili established a school in Tbilisi, and so in the school he taught these enlightenment ideas. One of his disciples, most prominent, was great Georgian poet Nicholas Baratashvili. Nicholas Baratashvili was a patently European poet. He's a romantic poet. He translates German romantic poetry. It is lost now. These translations are lost, but he translated them. And he's very much European Enlightenment type by his psychology also. He feels that, yes, there exists tradition, I understand, but I feel myself as alienated even from my centuries-long tradition. And this alienation shows my solitude in front of this difficult, ununderstandable world, where even religion doesn't help me to understand my place here, because I have lost my childish religious faith. So what can I do? How can I define my place in this world? And this kind of very European romantic sentiments you feel in Baratashvili's poetry. I guess he's translated in German, in Russian is very beautiful translation by Boris Pasternak. So I think he must be translated in German. Now, in American poetess Lynn Coffin is making an English translation as well. But there are some other English translations as well. So this kind of European waves came to Georgia through Russian Empire, and in 19th century there was a conscious project of Georgian intellectuals. They were called Tergdaleulni. Terek is a river in the North Caucasus, and so those Georgian intellectuals left, so they have drunk from Terek, from this river, so they abandoned Georgia for Russia, and in Russian best universities they learned European ideas, and they came back. So they were European educated people who started to create new Georgian nation. So new Georgian nation should have been both traditional, because Georgia was a very traditional nation with traditional Christianity, and also European. So they brought these ideas of European Enlightenment, this human freedom, emancipation of labor, emancipation of women, all these ideas they took to Georgia, and they started to write not only kind of these journalistic articles, but also in their poems, in their novels, in their short stories or long stories, they were expressing these European ideas. It was a conscious, very powerful project of creation of new Georgian European nation. So you read in Ilya Chauchavadze, this father of new Georgian nation, this very Hegelian type ideas that we should not be like Chinese. It's Hegel's word, the Chinese type of civilization which turns into circles, because you have to imitate what your forefathers have done. That means that it's a culture of imitation of the past. It's a circle going to circles. So we shouldn't be like Chinese, but we should be like Europeans, who search for development, who do not deny the past, but take from the past what is holy. So Ilya calls holy this Hegelian idea of rational seed. So from past you take this rational seed, and upon this you establish something new, which was not before, but it's totally a brand new thing happening. And when you read Ilya Georgian, this generation writer, they also develop a new type of understanding of labor. Before, labor was considered some kind of curse for fallen human nature. But now Ilya is presenting labor in more kind of Protestantic way, that labor, by your working in a social space, and by your doing this kind of lake work for your nation, this is your Christian service as well. So this work and Christian calling, he somehow united them together. Especially you see this in his writings against this serfdom, and how this labor is dignifying the human being. And he's very Christian, but at the same time he is not otherworldly. He wants to make Christianity kind of a ferment of changing the social political reality. It's very European as well. So these waves, these changes were very strong in Georgia, and they succeeded somehow to create this Georgian new understanding of Georgian nation. But this was somehow cut short by Soviet invasion in 1921, and then we had 70 years of communism. I wouldn't say that whatever was happening culturally in the 70 years, everything was bad. Not at all. Especially in fiction writing, you see this how to say Aesopus tongue, yes, by metaphors, by some kind of indications. By removing this plot to an ancient past, the writers try to convey sometimes very dangerous meanings meanings for the establishment. Sometimes they were, how to say, the establishment guessed that it was so, and these writers were then sent to Siberia or even killed. We have writers and poets who underwent these repressions by Stalin purges. Even for our one famous probably one of the greatest writers of 20th century, Gigineishvili, was shot by a signature of Stalin. So his execution happened by Stalin's signature himself. So this is a kind of Aesopus tongue. You see that it's a very deep writings and very important novels and poems were written at the time. They're world masterpieces, even though they happen in this 70 years of communism. So also not only in literature, you see the same in movies, and sometimes this was allowed by state. Sometimes, what do I mean? Sometimes state felt that unless we allow for some steam to go out from humans from this, and if this repression is too harsh, then we shall get a real revolution. So let you, at least through films or through novels, this some kind of resentment be aired, and so we allow it just a bit, let's say. And so sometimes the masterpieces were created with the state turning deaf ear or blind eye to these effects. Maybe you have heard about this famous movie, The Repentance, by Tengiz Abuladze. It was filmed in 1984, and it criticized very clearly and blatantly the Stalin purges. Of course, they put it in different milieu, but it was like very clearly understood message that Stalin, this Soviet purges and Soviet repressions were criticized by this movie. And this was somehow allowed by state for this movie to be shown. Perhaps it was a preparation for Gorbachev's reforms, because Gorbachev already started to speak about these things, and they developed this theory of glasnost, or openness, that we should speak about some violations of human rights during Soviet past. So this was, the Georgians, of course we can speak about science, about developments in humanitarian sciences, which was quite important development. We have this in psychology, we had Dmitry Uznadze, who created very famous theory of disposition, and it's a world famous theory in psychology even now. We had good schools in Soviet Union of classical philology, for instance. I am myself a classical philologist and somehow a part of the school, but this school was existing in Soviet Union and they had big connections with the Western countries as well. So these traditions, some kind of scientific traditions, started to continued in Soviet Union, even under great ideological pressure. Of course, a scholar in Georgia, when he was writing or she was writing some important study, this study was not ideological sometimes at all, but there were important studies and important discoveries. In the foreword, they had to write some kind of quotations from Marx, Engels, Lenin, and then to write their study. And in their study was nothing communist. We had a brilliant philosopher of Georgian origin. He is a Georgian philosopher, but he lived mostly in Russia. Who was reading lectures, and his lectures was not Marxist lectures, but he somehow tried to show that the infinity and eternity of philosophy, that it's beyond all kinds of ideological schemes. And so when he came to Georgia, he also gave his lectures here, and he was a very influential figure in Georgian public life in 90s. So this in 90s we got the independence. Soviet Union collapsed, and Georgia became an independent country with lots of problems, 3 civil wars, and lots of problems with our president, first president Zviad-Gavsburdia's time. In his time, country was shifted towards certain authoritarianism and also showing with some very strong chauvinistic traits that Georgia is kind of ethnicity was more protruded, and as if Georgian ethnicity has greater, I would say, rights in this land or against other ethnicities. It was not like saying that one should kind of oppress other ethnicities, but still you are a host and they are guests in a way, but respected guests, but guests nevertheless. So this was the first Georgian president's attitude. But this was changed during Shevardnadze's time. Of course, it was changed, and Georgia became much more European in the outlook. And these ideas of NATO integration, European integration, was very famous already in Shevardnadze's time in late 90s. We had Saakashvili's government, and with this initial very strong thrust towards this making strong state institutions, but unfortunately it slided into these human rights violations and many problems with this and towards authoritarianism. And so now we have this idea that countries is going towards Europe, and with lots of problems, and we have a democracy, very fragile, but still a democracy. So what's the point here? That in no other country, like in Caucasus, in North Caucasus, of course not because it's Russia, not in Azerbaijan, not in Europe. Now we have very undemocratic events happening in Turkey. In this very difficult and gloomy region, Georgia is kind of a success story. We have a very fragile, young, fragile democracy, but it is still a democracy. It's a very fragile, it can break very easily, but still it is here. And Georgia is also an interesting country because, as I have told you, it is very much traditional country. At the same time, we are with eyes wide open, like in Europe, with eyes wide open. We want to, how to say, integrate everything what is good in Western culture. So these two things, Europe, I don't think is as traditional as Georgia. Georgia is very traditional, but at the same time, very much willing to adopt something new. So this is a kind of a unique feature of Georgian culture. Also, this Caucasus House is very important in this sense because this Caucasus House unites these two aspects: traditionalism and novelty. And since Georgia is kind of modeled from other Caucasian nations, really, when I was in some conference dedicated to Merab Mamardashvili in Moscow, a guy from Ingushetia told me that we look at Georgia as a model, and we dream that Georgia succeeds, because if Georgia succeeds, we have a hope that other Caucasian nations will also succeed in democracy. So here I end my little speech. It was impossible to show this 2,000 years of Georgian literary culture in 15 minutes, but with your questions, maybe we go deeper into some details. Thank you for it.
Yes, I think it's very interesting to hear about the history and also the different influence on Georgia in literature and also in religion. You were talking about the blood is important, but the faith, the religion was important. How do you find this supported by government, by the state of Georgia, this kind of multi-faith way of talking about the same thing, maybe the spiritual thing, which you find in literature, you find probably in many forms of culture and religion. Is it supported? Let's say the Caucasus has a Russian part, which is probably with an iron, it's just one big gray mass, Russian. And there's another part of Caucasus. How is it supported by the state, in a political way and in private life?
In a political way, there are some kind of motions towards kind of Georgians, kind of political maybe rapprochements with, let's say, this North Caucasus, with Abhazians and with so those. Caucasians, with Caucasians, because initially they fought against Georgians during Georgian-Abkhaz war, but now Georgian state, it started in already in previous government's time. This Georgian state tries to make some links with those people who fought against Georgians before in Georgian-Abkhaz war, and so now there is great, how to say, success in this. And already those some political links are there, some state steps toward this. But I would not say culturally state makes this kind of conscious efforts or finances this thing. For instance, Caucasus House does these things, yes, organizes these events. But I wouldn't say the state does it in any conscious way. When I said that Georgia is model for Caucasian countries, it by itself, it somehow happens that they look at Georgia as possible success story. Because Armenia cannot oppose Russia at all, because they need Russia against Azerbaijan. In Azerbaijan there is oil, and with oil democracy they cannot survive. And so in Georgia somehow now is linked towards Europe, towards America more than Russia. And Russia is considered as a violator of Georgian territory, and they have no right to announce Abkhazia and South Ossetia independent country. So Georgia, we are at a political enmity with Russia, and we built these institutions in order to show ourselves that we are worthy of this support from the West. And it's not that we will try to adjust ourselves to the West. It's kind of also inner desire that we want to live in a democratic country. Nobody asked Georgians to go to demonstrations when they saw these human rights violations. It's just in yourself. You cannot get some such things from outside. You have to have inner passion for this. And I think Georgians have this inner passion to build a democracy. Unless it is so that you will have nothing. You have a facade of democracy and nothing else. But Georgia is really a part of this understanding of Caucasus as a possible success story. Here you see this Caucasian delegates, students come. I have delivered a few lectures here in Caucasian House. For instance, 3 days ago I spoke about religion and secularism in Georgia. And so it was also interesting talk and interesting question. It must have lasted for 1 hour, but it lasted for 2 hours because so many interesting and pertinent questions are there with secularism and religiosity in modern Georgia. And so this, of course, Georgia in Soviet Union times, Georgia was very important for the creation of all Caucasian somehow solidarity. Even our philologists like Arnold Chikobava a Georgian philologist who wrote Georgian grammar. He wrote grammar for different Caucasian nations. And he showed the similarities of Caucasian languages, and it was very much supported at the time by the state, of course, because it was Soviet state, but still they supported these studies. And Georgian Chikobava made these Caucasian studies very deep, and still he is very much respected in North Caucasus. Also, our scholar, modern day scholar, Zaza Alexidze, he made a study of Albanian language. Albanian language is a language which was spoken in Azerbaijan until 9th century. So it was a kingdom of Albanians until 9th century. Then it was occupied, and no Albanians are there anymore. But he studied the language and discovered this language of Udus. And Udis are like in North Caucasus, a little nation. And nowadays, these Udi people are rediscovering their Christian identity, some of them, because they see that they have this Christian text. The ancestors have written this Christian text before 9th century. So these kind of studies, Georgian scholars sometimes contribute importantly to this, to other Caucasian nations, other Caucasian people.
Danke.
Can I ask you something about, you talked about, I think, a medieval Christian vision of direct communion with God. Does anybody hold that vision today?
So I said on the contrary.
Or did I misunderstand you?
No, in Middle Ages, you have this very much a Byzantine hierarchical idea of Christianity. So you have this many steps before you approach God. You have many steps, many venerable steps. You have deacons, priests, bishops, and this earthly hierarchy is expressed by heavenly hierarchy of lesser saints, greater saints, like lesser angels, greater angels, archangels, and you have all these steps, reverent steps. It's Middle Ages, and when you read this medieval literature, you see this great reverence towards all these steps. It's very much elaborate and very difficult, also very elite. But I said this, Gigineishvili introduces very much Protestantic attitude that you don't have to deal with all these hierarchies. You take this Bible, you take your conscience, and you directly converse with God. This kind of thing, new twist into religiosity, you see in Gigineishvili, 18th century, not before.
That's still alive today.
Is it still alive today? It's a tricky question. It's a tricky question, yes. Actually, I think Catholicism and Orthodoxy still retain this elaborate attitude. The liturgies, but of course we are living in an post-enlightenment world, yes? And enlightenment is not a phenomenon which is a phenomenon of only little culture or something. Enlightenment is a universal phenomenon. So now even Catholic or Orthodox already should be enlightened in order to be in tune with history. You cannot be not enlightened. What Luther has done or what Descartes has done is not just for a little or local phenomenon. It's just all a civilizational phenomenon which is irrevocable. So you cannot pretend that you have not read Luther or Descartes anymore or Emmanuel Kant, even if you are Orthodox or Catholic. So you already have a new understanding of personality and new understanding of responsibility. I think that's a very good question, because sometimes some priests or bishops try to present Christianity, Orthodox Christianity, in a very medieval way, just with a position teaching kind of pious humility and obedience, without understanding very well towards which I am obedient, which is a principle of enlightenment. Ilya Chauchavadze, this father of Georgian nation, just in the 19th century, he was saying that I believe only in such an obedience in which your intellect is a master. So obedience where your intellect is not a master is a wrong obedience, is an ill-founded obedience. And sometimes in modern day times, I think also in everywhere it can happen, in Catholicism it can happen, in Orthodoxy, a bishop or priest would say that, oh, listen to me, it is so, and don't ask questions, but just obey and follow it. It happens. So that's why I think that enlightenment is needful also in religious communities, very much so.
Is there a monastic tradition?
Yeah, there is a monastic tradition in Georgia. Because, as I told you, these 13 monasteries in 6th century, established in 6th century, some of them have survived with unbroken continuity. Like, for instance, Shion and David Gareja, I think they had this unbroken continuity. It's a few years of breach in Soviet Union's time, maybe, but they still they retain this ancient culture of monasticism. You can travel there actually. It's only 2 hours from Tbilisi, David Gareja or Shion. You can see those houses.
Okay, thank you.
So I never
May I have one question? Thank you very much. It was very interesting for me also, as for Georgian also. I wanted to ask, like, you were speaking about the monasteries, which were quite like, let's say, in modern terms, let's say, very good in you are absorbing information and you are delivering information. That's because right. you are spreading information from yourself. Have you thought about, like, in the current situation, for example, Georgian state, what can substitute this type of? I understand that, of course, if you go to study and you are, of course, you as individual is getting something, and like you are speaking about Georgia, that's good. Maybe embassies, but what can we invent in that terms, like to be more active outside, also to bring some knowledge in Georgia?
There have this, some exchange programs are there in universities. For example, I'm in University, or I know also similar programs are in Georgian State University. They have lots of exchange projects, like foreign professors coming and going. So also now Georgian, how say, the state ministers work with these things. For instance, next year too, there will be this book fair in Frankfurt, and Georgia will be a host of it, and these kind of things are happening. So I think slogan of this Georgia's slogan in this book fair will be like back to Europe or something, back to European home or something like this. So these kind of things are happening, but they must be more intensive. On the other hand, I think Georgians can also contribute to European culture, because it's not that it's not a joke when you have literature from like 5th century onwards. I'm breaking a chain of literature with so many developments. Patrizzi, the philosopher Ioannis Patrizzi, can become like a very good part of all Western medieval philosophy curricula. I'm translating Ioannis Patrizzi into English now. So after 2 years, probably this book will be published in English, I hope. So I think this, after that, Patrizzi can become part of any European curricula of medieval philosophy, because he does great things, and it's very important when such thing can happen in the 13th century. Thomas Aquinas would not dare to say such thing, which Patrizzi was daring at the time. So I think that the Georgian culture can somehow contribute to world culture. Not only European culture, to world culture, if it is duly advertised in such a studied and shown in it with a due merit. Of course, other things, cultural things are, we say that we should kind of assimilate to European ways, and in many aspects we are very quite behind. Yes, you see the streets, how people are driving here, and not following the laws very much, and this litter in the streets. All these things, it should be changed, of course, and we are very much way behind Europe with this respect. But on the other hand, there are some good features in Georgians' cultural way of attitude with each other. This tradition of friendship, because many Georgians keep their kindergarten friends for the rest of their lives, and it's very deep understanding of friendship, that it cannot be like your school friend, you remains your best friend forever. And this kind of idea of families, when grandmothers and grandfathers find it their, joy to bring up godchildren. And many times you have these 3-generation Georgian families, not only because of this material needs that they cannot afford to buy a new flat, but still it's in a culture that grandmothers and grandfathers are very much, part of raising the little children. And maybe it's also very, not very bad. It will show some kind of continuity of generations. And maybe Europe and America can learn from Georgians with this respect. So, but these are different and other issues. With modern Georgian writings, it's many beautiful developments and interesting waves are happening.